Take it away. Okay, we're
Yes,
live.
we're live.
All right. Well, welcome everybody to a special edition of, and this is our new name, Biblical Criticism Book Club. Thank you, Wayne. And we actually have Dr. Moll himself joining us today. We just finished a couple weeks ago his 2009 thesis called At the Left Hand of Christ. Dr. Moll, thank you very much for taking the time to join us and talk to us about your book that we read. And I was just wondering, do you want to give us a real brief background on who you are, the field you work in, and some of your academic history to start us off?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. Thank you. Well, I'm 34 years old. I did my PhD thesis at the University of Edinburgh in 2009, as you already mentioned. For the last 6 years, I've been lecturing at the University of Mainz in Germany, finishing my Habilitation, which is kind of a postdoctoral thesis, which is the next step in German academia. You have to finish your Habilitation before you can apply for a university chair. And this, in fact, I just handed in. I'm waiting for the results. On the 23rd, I think, 23rd of March, the committee comes together, and then we'll know whether I made it or not. And my PhD thesis is, as you all know, on Marcion in patristics. So I'm not a New Testament scholar. I work in church history, which is why my postdoctoral thesis is nowhere even near that. It's on Albert Schweitzer, who is by now also a figure of church history and of history of theology. So I cover kind of both ends, 2nd century and the 20th century, for my career in church history. But still, my main interest still is in patristics and early church history, and it's just required that you do your postdoctoral thesis on something different to prove your worth. As an academic and as a church historian, you have to cover more than one era.
Gotcha. Would you mind, just for the sake of the listeners and people who view this in the future, could you give us a real brief summary of who Marcion was exactly?
Yes. Well, Marcion was a 2nd century Christian theologian. That's about the consensus. Everybody else is debatable. He was from Asia Minor, north of today's Turkey, born, and that's already where it's getting slippery. I'd say he was born around 100, maybe 110. He then made his career in Rome. He was what's the word? Not a sailor, a merchant of, people who make money. See, that's why my English is like
like a ship trader kind of.
Yes, indeed, that's what he was. Yes, indeed, thank you. He was a rather wealthy fellow, and he started his own church movement in Rome about the middle of the 2nd century. He was the first person we know of who actually was, had a break with the church for doctrinal reasons. There were other people, of course, kicked out of the community for whatever they did, but this is the first person who really found an anti-movement, a different church, a different denomination, as it were. He does that about middle of 2nd century, and his main criticism, or his concept, is that he believes that the Old Testament and the New Testament, which by the time we're not called that, but we'll just call it that for the sake of simplicity, are revelations of two different gods. So the God of the Old Testament, the Creator, the Lawgiver, is not the same God as the God revealed in Jesus Christ. He tries to prove that by a work he calls the Antitheses. It's a rather interesting work, mostly lost, but we know somehow how it looked, in which he kind of juxtaposed sentences, phrases from the Old Testament and the New Testament where he said, look, this cannot be the revelation of one and the same God. And obviously, that opinion was considered unorthodox by the church, and so they went their separate ways. His movement was rather successful until the 4th century, when it died out, mostly after the Constantinian change, and so that's about it. He became rather popular again in the 19th and 20th century, when particularly Protestant scholars felt that he was kind of a 2nd century Martin Luther, and he actually, despite of course him being wrong about the two different gods, that he was kind of the first person who established that the New Testament is the important text, and the grace and the love of God is more important than the Old Testament law, which is in a way close to what Luther said, but of course with this little difference that Luther did not believe in two different gods.
Gotcha. Well, thank you very much. So, Wayne, did you want to ask your first question about that? About Marcion and Dr. Moll's work? You're muted.
Yes, I can't hear you.
I thought we were going to ask Daniel's question first.
Oh, you're right. Sorry about that. Okay, since Daniel couldn't join us, and he's very sorry about that, he had to take a driver's test in Kansas. He may join us later on. I'm not sure when he's going to get back, but since it's a great general question that he submitted, we should do it first. So anyway, he asks, and this is from Daniel Galata, Dr. Moll, there seems to be a recent surge in Marcionite research, but with different subjects, the canon, the man Marcion, his influence in later centuries. Why do you think Marcion has become so interesting again for so many scholars?
Well, it must be because of my great book, obviously. But it is funny that when I started this, I was really in a kind of race to be the first. Somehow Marcion was in the air in the late, first decade of this century. And I knew several people working on Marcion by the time already in 2006, 2007. And I was anxious to be be the first to get the new book out, because it's always nice to be the first, and because if somebody else publishes first, you have to rewrite the whole thing. And but still, I cannot explain why this is happening now. I mean, Marcion has an advantage, because he is very interesting to both church historians like myself and New Testament scholars. And you will find that many people who now publish books on him come from either of these fields. And so that makes him an ideal candidate. And the other thing is that, just as, and I was joking of course about my book, but it's true that once one new thesis is published, and then the second one, the third one, the discussion keeps going again. And of course, the other thing is that for about 100 years, we did not have much of Marcionite research. The first and last, actually, main study on him was by Adolf von Harnack, a German theologian who published a huge book on Marcion in 1921, I think it was, I'm not entirely sure, but about 100 years ago. And this seemed to, be the book on Marcion for the next 100 years. And apparently people have now have come to realize that this cannot, be the last word on it. And I'm glad. I mean, that Marcion is becoming more popular and more interesting again. I think he's one of the most fascinating characters of church history. And so I look forward to continuing the debate, although I did not actually work or publish on him in the last 5 years, but I still try to follow the discussion.
Gotcha. Well, thank you. Wayne, did you want to go ahead? Or did anyone have any questions on Marcion, why he's so popular now? Any follow-ups to that?
Wasn't there also wasn't it Daniel who asked something about what can we do to make him more popular again or something? Or
I think Reuven asked that.
Oh, that was Reuven, I'm sorry, right.
That's okay. Yeah, you can tackle that one too if you wanted.
I think it's already happening.
Yeah.
And so we don't have to do anything.
Yes, that's
I think it's an inevitable consequence, I think, of during the 80s and 90s when the Jesus Seminar came into being, and then that was followed up by the Acts Seminar.
Yeah.
And these are just natural questions that follow one upon another.
I'm trying to find Reuven's questions.
Well, I know we're addressing questions to Moll, but can we give our own answers to some of these if we're quick? I'm seeing a lot of people who I talk to who are interested in Marcion is due to a resurgence of interest in like the 20th century Christian scholars who were talking about Marcion. So it's like going back and reading more Couchot and Strauss and some of those that, okay, why did they have the opinions they did? And in order to answer the question, you have to go back to the original source materials in Marcion, etc. So.
Yeah, it is an interesting phenomenon that he does seem to be getting more popular. Maybe are people getting more interested in the early heretics in general, do you think, or is it specifically focused on Marcion?
Well, they are, let's say, they are less popular and more popular heretics because some of them address things or have heresies that are hardly interesting anymore these days.
Yeah.
But Marcion has he addressed a topic that has reurged again over the last 2,000 years. There were many people who, in one way or the other, thought like Marcion did, not with the same consequences perhaps, but the idea that there is somehow, well, it all goes back to the question of why is the world so bad? Why is the world evil? This big question, and of course Marcion has a perfect answer because he says, well, obviously because the creator is evil, or at least incompetent, and that's a fair solution to the problem. You know, if the creator is incompetent, then the world is not perfect. And so this idea has come up again over and over centuries, and I believe that people, I don't know how it is in America these days, but in Germany we are having discussion again, do we really need the Old Testament? You know, shouldn't we just concentrate on the Gospel and on the New Testament and say, well, okay, the Old Testament is there, but we don't really need it. That was Harnack's theory, actually. And so this is something which also is coming up again in German church, particularly German Protestantism. And so I guess Marcion has, unlike other heretics, he had a topic, he had an idea that is attractive, was attractive, and always will be attractive to some people.
Gotcha. So does anyone have a suggestion as far as more general questions? Because we kind of wanted to follow that format. I'm looking at over some of Reuven's. Some of them are pretty specific. That particular one was more general. We got Daniel's.
Well, I'm not sure if I got Reuven right, but did I read that right? That he kind of I may have misunderstood, but Reuven, do you want people to be more Marcionite today, or did I misread that?
Reuven actually doesn't have a mic. He may type it in the side, and we can. Oh,
he said, actually, yes, I do.
Yeah. Okay.
So why is that?
Now we have
Anybody
to wait.
else? Yeah, sure.
He's typing. He doesn't have a microphone. Yeah. Is that mycophobic or something?
That's actually a good reason, Reuven. Yeah, I feel like Marcion's ideas lead to a greater respect for people of other faiths, especially Judaism.
Well, that is true. I mean, people have wondered a lot about the question, what would have happened if Marcion's ideas prevailed? And which, of course, means, you know, what-if questions are always difficult. But it's true that Marcion was far from being anti-Semitic or anything. You know, he had pity for the Jews, you know, them having such a bad God. And so, yes, indeed, and the whole struggle between Christians and Jews came about because both claimed to be the rightful heirs of the Old Testament. well, the texts in there. And so if Marcion's ideas had prevailed, that would not have happened, of course, because then they would have said, well, of course, well, you have your text and we have ours, and let's go about our ways. And the struggle only comes about when two people fight about the same thing. Mm-hmm. And that's what happened here, because both claimed that it's their testament and it's their text. And so the Christians said that the Jews didn't get it right, and the Jews have no longer any right to use it. That's where this feeling of superiority comes from, and this is one of the main reasons for the eternal struggle between the two.
Interesting.
So yeah, I do have another general question that can. I wanted to save it to the end because it's a more lighthearted question, but I guess I'll use it for an introductory question now. If you had to cast a movie about early Christianity, who would you have play Marcion?
Well, it's funny that you asked that, because I don't know if you guys know, before this thesis, I actually wrote a little play on Marcion, which is called, actually I have it here somewhere, there it is. It's called Meet Marcion, and it's a play set in the 2nd century, and Tertullian, which is of course anachronistic because they didn't live at the same time. Tertullian comes to visit Marcion in Rome, and we performed that actually a couple of times, even at the Oxford Patricians Conference in 2007, which was a great success. And we had a great actor for Marcion at the time, a good friend of mine. But I think you are wondering more about celebrities and famous actors. Well, it's hard to judge. I mean, it depends if you want to do a realistic movie or a fun movie, you know, because you can do a lot with Marcion and make him more interesting to today's audience, or you can really set him in his time, and then it becomes slightly less interesting.
Okay. I was wondering how you kind of, in your own head, pictured Marcion's temperament and stuff. Like, what kind of person would have the same kind of temperament you picture him having?
Well, first of all, I think he was a lot younger than people. Of course, he got older by the time, but I mean, when he started this movement, I think he was a lot younger than people usually assume. Harnack believed that he was about 60 when he started this movement, and I think that's way too old. And I think he was a very serious person, intellectual, and someone who, well, obviously for some reason had a very pessimistic worldview. He obviously wasn't very pleased with the state the world was in, which happens to be, as well, at least from my perception, happens to be a characteristic of intellectual people. And so I think he's young. Well, I would portray him young in the movie. He is, well, he's intelligent, and he is a man of, well, deep convictions, but still kind of a troubled soul. You know, somehow not very happy, not getting along with the world, trying to escape this world. And so that's what I meant. You could either portray him as kind of a, well, psychologically difficult person, you know, like I know Michael Keaton in Birdman, or you make him a kind of Sherlock Holmes character like Benedict Cumberbatch, you know, someone who's kind of kind of a more of a sociopath character, you know, someone who's not very into other people's emotions, someone who's very intelligent, who goes about his own ways, not, well, realizing what's happening around him so much. So it's somewhere between these two.
Good picks.
I got more questions, but I want somebody else to go.
That leads into Shauna's question, though. That's kind of related to that.
I vote Nicolas Cage.
Fair enough.
Shauna, did you want to throw in your question? I don't know if she's on her mic right now.
Oh, we have a girl among us?
Excuse me?
We have a woman here?
Yep, Shauna.
Oh, good.
Oh, she's not on mic.
Sorry, I meant no disrespect at all. I just was surprised. I thought it was a.
Hold on. Am I on now?
Yep,
yes, you are on.
Okay. I read this novel called Memoirs of a Gnostic Dwarf, and it's a very naughty novel, but very interesting, just to warn anybody that might want to read it. But all the Gnostic characters were hideously deformed, and some of them were even circus freaks. And so I wonder, Marcion was really angry. Could he have been really deformed, or, the victim of some horrible tragedy?
Actually, yeah, that's a good point. Obviously, something happened in his life that made him feel uncomfortable with himself, not only with the world, but also with himself. The way he talks about particularly any kind of bodily function, particularly anything involving sexuality, he refers to the womb as the sewer of a woman. He talks about the filthy mixture of fluid and blood and all these things when it comes to any kind of sexual activity. So there's some sort of pathological trait there. He had some issues with that, no doubt. And it is possible that he kind of felt unhappy with his body, maybe. Well, this may go a little bit too far, but maybe was even incapable of loving a woman for whatever reason. And it is not, as you say, it's not unlikely for somebody who is, again, somehow displeased with himself to develop such a negative worldview. It's actually a good point. As for the Gnostics, like Ptolemy or Valentinus, I don't think so, because we know that they kind of they were hanging out with witch women and they were paid by them for their intellectual capabilities, of course. But they seem to be more of a kind of VIP party people. I don't think they were that unattractive.
Did anyone else want to go, or do we want to tackle the Luke redaction thing yet, or what do you guys think?
I'd like to throw one of my other questions in, actually. It's just a good time to do it now.
Yeah.
Did Marcion's New Testament have any direct references to the Old Testament God or to Satan? And if so, were they considered the same character or separate characters?
Well, there were certainly references to the Old Testament. That is for sure. We know that. Particularly, in his mind, negative ones. As for Satan, I read your question about that, and it got me thinking. I'm not entirely sure. I believe that Satan, Satan features only very few times in the New Testament, given Marcion's New Testament, of course, because he didn't have Matthew, so this whole situation is in Matthew 4, I think it is. It's not featured in his gospel. Paul mentions Satan once, prohibiting him to go to Rome. But I don't think that Satan was a very important figure to Marcion, given that he is, in his New Testament, and we haven't mentioned it yet, just to get everybody on board. Marcion's New Testament featured 10 letters of Paul, and the gospel, something which somehow looked like to our canonical Gospel of Luke in a shorter version, just as the letters of Paul were shorter in Marcion's canon. So Satan doesn't feature that much in that. So we have no evidence for what Marcion thought of this name or this character. But as to your first question, yes, there are many references to the Old Testament, but again, all in his mind negative.
Can you give an example of the reference to the Old Testament God in his New Testament?
I would have to look that up. Just a second.
He has lots in the antitheses, right? That's what. Yeah. Okay.
But he was asking about the canon, so.
Okay.
Yeah. I thought, like in the Evangelion and the Apostolic.
Yes, right.
I thought most references to Theos were to his, the good God. So I'm wondering, are there any references anywhere there to the Old Testament God?
Oh, I'm sorry. Then I misheard you. I thought you meant reference to the Old Testament in general.
Yes.
No, that's a good point. I don't think so. When he, as you said, when he speaks of Theos, that's of course the God of Father of Christ, the New Testament God, and he talks about, well, Paul mentions Old Testament prophecies, and Jesus mentioning John the Baptist and others, and Marcion let that in, or he didn't cut it out. And I don't think that the Old Testament God as a person, as a being, is addressed. No, that's a good point. I don't think it is.
Thank you.
Did you want to keep going, Wayne, or bounce to someone else? What do you think?
I feel I'm doing all the fun here with all the questions.
Oh, it's okay. We'll get to.
Oh, we're all having fun. We're all having fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to pop the big question then. Yeah, the question about you argue in your thesis that Marcion removed parts of Luke or Proto-Luke that he didn't like, and it was Marcion's doing that made his version of the Evangelion shorter and his version of the Apostolicon shorter. But a lot of other scholars have revisited that question and come to a very different conclusion. In fact, I wanted to read one of the footnotes out of Jason D. Badoon's book, The First New Testament Marcion Scriptural Canon. He writes, "It is therefore striking." I'll preface this by saying that elsewhere in the book he speaks very highly of your work, actually. Regarding the life of Marcion and stuff, he follows you fairly closely in places. But that's what makes this even more. It is therefore striking that Sebastian Moll, who otherwise calls into question almost everything said in our polemical sources about Marcion, accepts unquestioningly what they said about his editorial activity, cutting out all passages which show any positive reference to the Old Testament, and all texts being completely freed from any positive reference to the Old Testament. These statements could only be said by someone who has not made a close examination of the attested content of Marcion's Evangelion and Apostolicon, which contain multiple positive references to Old Testament figures and their acts. The relatively lesser amount of such references in these texts compared to their Catholic versions can be accounted for on non-ideological grounds, as was already done by Semler, who attributed the difference to the distinctive needs of the Gentile mission. But do you have a response to Badoon on that matter?
Well, yeah. My first response is that the problem with many of these theories is that until, in fact, just last month, last year, it finally came out. For a long time, we did not have a reliable reconstruction of Marcion's gospel text. What we had is very, very good reconstruction of his Apostolicon by Ulrich Schmid, German scholar, published this book in the, I think, late 90s. And so that's what I work with. And as for the gospel, I work with what I have using Euphemius and Tertullian. And I gladly admit that I may have overlooked one of these passages. It struck me, though, that he wrote that because I was very careful when I, of course...
Can I interrupt for a second? You were
Sure.
talking about reconstructions. I just want to mention that the book by Badoon that this footnote is from is where he presents his reconstruction. So Badoon actually has done a reconstruction.
No, I know, of course.
So.
But, oh, you mean, well, but this, I'm sorry, is that this, I'm obviously confused with these people. Is that the older book or is this a recent one?
It's recent.
That's a recent one, right. You see, well, as I said, at the time I did not have his reconstruction.
Yeah.
And I must admit I didn't have the time to actually check it out. A colleague of mine, Dieter Roth, who actually just lives around the corner here in Mainz, just published last month. He published his reconstruction of Marcion's Gospel, and he was actually with me in Edinburgh when I wrote my thesis, so he was someone I relied heavily on. And so, as I said, I had not had time to interact with Badoon's reconstruction, and it's possible that he established things that I did not see. In my view, well, again, what I did at the time was I worked with Tertullian and Epiphanius, which are the two authors which we use for our reconstruction.
Yeah. This book by Dune came out in 2013, so it is very recent.
Yeah, just 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And now we actually have 2 reconstructions with Ross's reconstruction too. So yeah, obviously I could not interact with that. And but let me perhaps go a little bit deeper into this whole Luke Marcion thing, which is perhaps the question, particularly for New Testament scholars when it comes to Marcion. So let me just again get everybody on the same level here. We know that Marcion used a gospel. Well, first of all, he had only one gospel that he used. He didn't have a full gospel canon, only one gospel. And this gospel was, well, looked a lot like our canonical gospel of Luke, only a lot shorter. Many passages missing. When you compare the two, yeah, Marcion's was much shorter. And all the early fathers, starting with Irenaeus and then Tertullian and Epiphanius, wrote that Marcion shortened the canonical gospel of Luke. Tertullian saying that he was a pontic, well, he was from Pontus, that's north of today's Turkey. He was a pontic mouse gnawing away the gospel. That's what Tertullian said about him. And so the unanimous opinion of the fathers is that Marcion shortened the existing version of Luke. And this was accepted for a long time. And it was not before the 19th century that people, particularly German scholars, suggested that it may have been the other way around. That in fact, Marcion had some sort of Luke, an original Luke, which was then enlarged by the church and added to the canon. This used to be an opinion of only a few scholars, a really minority opinion, and it became popular again, as you just said, over the last 10 years. In fact, even over the last 5 years, you might say, because at the time I wrote, it was still minority opinion. And so, where do I stand on that? As you just said, I still believe that, indeed, Knox and Tyson, thank you. I believe that the fathers are right in suggesting that Marcion shortened Luke, and I don't believe that the church enlarged Marcion's version to turn it into our canonical Luke. And why is that? Well, first of all, we have the, as I said, unanimous testimony of the fathers, which is no proof, but I think we should state that this is unanimous, and there's not one character in the early church who claims otherwise. So I believe that the burden of proof lies with those who think that Marcion actually had the older version and canonical Luke is later. Secondly, it seems very strange to me that, well, we know that Marcion shortened the letters of Paul. We know that for sure. At least I never heard anybody argue otherwise. I don't think that anybody believes that our letters of Paul are kind of enlarged versions of Marcion's letters.
Couchot argued that exact thing. Yeah, that the Catholic versions of the Apostolicon are expansions of what Marcion had.
Sorry.
And he gives 4 specific examples and then 7 more general examples in Couchot's article from 1930, I think, or 1928 he wrote. But in one place, like in Romans 1:17, he mentions that verses 18 until 2 verse 1 seem to be an interpolation later. And part of his evidence for that is that the interpolator seems to have misunderstood a Greek word in Romans 1:17. And that to think that the shorter version was an abridgment just doesn't make sense of that confusion over that word. But that could be an isolated case. It could be that that's an interpolation, but other things are not. But Couchot seems to argue fairly well that there's a general pattern of the Catholic version being longer than the Marcionite version. In these regards, where it can only be explained as the Catholic version being an expansion of the Marcionite one. He was working from Harnack's reconstruction, which was partial, and had its own problems. But
Sure. Well, I don't think that this particular theory was ever taken up by any other scholar. Most people today who argue for the priority of Marcion's gospel still believe that Marcion actually shortened the letters of Paul and not the other way around, that the church kind of enlarged the existing letters that Marcion had. So even Knox or Tyson or Klinghardt or others, or Marcus Vincent, or any of these people, as far as I know, argues for the enlarged versions of the letters by the church and Marcion having the original ones. So if you allow, I'll just stick with that for a moment. So if that was established, then I think it is strange to assume that Marcion used one particular way of modus operandi to work with the letters of Paul, that he shortened according to his own agenda, and then for some reason had an original gospel that others enlarged. I think it is more likely to assume that he used the same, or that he worked the same way with both the letters and the gospel. My third argument for that would be that I think that all the counter-arguments that are brought forward against the theory that Marcion actually shortened the gospel are very weak. There are two main arguments, actually. One argument is that people like Knox or Tyson say that we have not been able to come up with a consistent pattern according to which Marcion changed the gospel. And that argument is weak for two reasons. First of all, it's not true, because I think I have established a comprehensive pattern for that. But even if I did not, then you see, the point is, if we do not have a consistent pattern according to which Marcion changed it, then we also don't have a consistent pattern according to which the church enlarged it. So both ways we are at an impasse. We don't know what happened because we cannot prove an operation in one or the other direction. And the other thing is that that's actually, that was one of the questions that you asked. Several scholars argued that it is strange that Marcion left in, so if he shortened the gospel, then it's strange that he left in so many passages that seem to contradict his own opinion, own agenda, but he did not. I used several examples to prove that many of the things that allegedly seem to contradict his own opinion do in fact not. So I think that while we'll never be able to explain everything that a person who lived 2,000 years ago did not, I think it is no mystery. It is perfectly explainable according to which system Marcion worked. It will always be debatable, and but again, the arguments from the pro-Marcion group, pro meaning that Marcion being the first, do not convince me.
Okay.
Well, I'll say that I'm not convinced in that case. I'm not convinced that Marcion was angry or pathologically disturbed.
I have to say it's mostly Paul Lewis's Couchot's arguments from way back 100 years ago that convinced me. From his analysis of Harnack, I mean, the ones he goes into detail on are just a few cases, but they're so strong in and of themselves, and just there's no conceivable way in my brain that the passages would have been shortened and make sense of the text we have. The longer version looks like a deliberate enlargement of something that made sense when it was shorter, but vice versa just doesn't work.
Well, usually you're right. Usual text criticism assumes that the shorter version is usually the original one, as you say.
Have you actually read Couchot's article?
Well, I think I did, but I'm not.
Okay.
I'm not too familiar with it to argue with you about it. I'm not saying that.
Yeah.
I wasn't here to argue anyway, so.
No, I didn't mean argue. I mean to get into a discussion about it, because I have it in front of me. So yeah, well, as you said, there are certain passages which are difficult to explain if actually Marcion's version is a shortened version. And as you also already mentioned, it is usually it is more likely that people enlarge texts than that they shorten text, which is a very unusual way to go about text in the history of Christianity. So, but again, assuming that Marcion did change, and by change I mean shorten the letters of Paul, which I still think, despite certain singular cases in which it may be questionable, I don't see how he should have possessed the original 10 letters, and that we have no evidence of that, and everything we have in the church tradition are enlarged versions of letters that the church issued. I just don't buy that.
You make your case largely for this in your thesis, right? In section 4 of Marcion's Bible, is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Correct.
So you go over some of the examples of where you thought that some of the passages that were odd to be in there if he was
Yes.
working with the original version, right? Like why is this in there? So anyway, for anyone listening, like section 4 of Dr. Moll's thesis, he lays that out in more detail than obviously we're going to be able to get to here. So, did anyone else want to take a stab at it, or I was gonna? I mean, not this specifically, but other questions.
Well, let me just maybe add one more thing that, for me, being a historian, impetuous rather than New Testament scholar, the question of Marcion's Gospel was, of course, for me, one question among many, which doesn't mean that I didn't put my mind to it and try to do the best I could. But it is quite possible that in this particular case, you guys know more about this than I do. Because I worked with what I had at the time, and so I still believe that what I wrote was correct, but I'm perfectly willing to be convinced. If everybody now is trying to argue the other case, and it seems that there is a shift, as you mentioned, in this, well, who knows? I may perfectly be wrong.
Yeah. If I may, there's a woman, her name is Judith Liu.
Yes.
She's about to publish her own work.
Yeah, next week.
Marcion. And there's just a really cool talk that she does on YouTube at the moment. I suggest that everyone listens to it. I think that specifically the criticism that she laid on you was something along the lines of you don't put enough emphasis on the fact that the patristics, yes, they're all unanimous on this, but they're all also unanimously polemic about this. And I think that's what she kind of accuses you of not giving enough weight to.
And there's also evidence from the patristics that the heretics were claiming otherwise. I mean, that they're actually the standard view among the heretics was that their version was first, and the Catholics had expanded that. We know that from the Catholics.
Yes, that's true. But you see, what they claim is that they re-established the original. Yes, that's what they say indeed. But that goes perfectly along with the idea of this conspiracy theory, because that's what Tertullian says. Tertullian says that the Marcionites believe that there was a huge conspiracy going on in the world by people who infiltrated the ranks of the apostles and kind of added wrong sayings, put wrong words into Jesus' mouth and added it to Paul's letters. So if that is true, then it makes perfect sense that the Marcionites, or Marcion himself, actually shortened the gospel and the letters because he believed in this infiltration. So, I'm sorry, but you can't argue that way. If you believe Tertullian as far as this conspiracy theory goes, then you have to accept the fact that Marcion changed it and shortened it, because that goes along with that. if there is a conspiracy, if people added wrong passages to the gospel, the Marcionites claim that they re-established the original one, then it makes perfect sense that he shortened it.
Right, I don't. Yeah, I don't. I think the Tertullian conspiracy theory is a polemically based.
No, you can state that, but it was just mentioned that the heretics claim otherwise, and that's not true. According to Tertullian, the heretics claim that they re-established an original false one, that they have a falsified text and they re-established the original one. So that goes perfectly along with that.
But why then would, as you in your book, one of the points you make is that the Marcionites specifically went out to evangelize already existing Christians, and there's a disconnect there for me.
I'm sorry, I don't follow you there.
Yeah,
it is true.
What do you think of Walter Bauer's theory? Do you think Walter Bauer was correct when he said that primarily and especially in the eastern provinces, in a lot of the places in the eastern provinces, the original form of Christianity, or the form that they were first introduced to, was the Marcionite variety, right? This is one of the conclusions that Walter Bauer came to in 1934.
Yes. Well, let me say that, first of all, it's perfectly possible. None of us knows. But the question is, there are two ways in which it can be the original one. It can be that, that you have people there, and then Marcionites come along and teach them Marcionism, or it's just possible that Marcionites move east and establish the first church there in the east and some eastern province, and then the first form of Christianity in these areas would be Marcionism. So that's perfectly.
No, that's true, but I mean, but that wouldn't preclude people actually being evangelized to in whatever province they went to, if they in fact moved. I think the former is more probable, that they went out evangelizing, and I wish Daniel were here because that's going to be the topic of his next thesis.
Yeah, I know.
Marcion the evangelist, specifically Marcion the one who's out there being, apostle,
Mm-hmm. Sure. No, I mean the main reason I argue for the case that Marcion evangelized or tried to kind of take people over from the existing church is that, I'm not saying that he exclusively did that, but it makes sense to me that a theory such as Marcion's, which is rather complex if you never heard of it, makes more sense to people who are within the existing church and feel kind of uncomfortable with certain issues, just like Marcion did, and he offers them an interesting solution to these problems. Whereas people who never heard of Christianity or Judaism may wonder what are these people talking about. So again, this is not an exclusive way of evangelism. It's perfectly possible that Marcionites went on to evangelize people who've never heard of Christianity before. That's perfectly possible.
I have to say thank you very much for coming on and doing this with us today. I really appreciate it, and I think I speak for the rest of us. So.
Yeah.
Pleasure.
Yeah.
Really great having you here.
We are getting close to the 1 hour mark. I just wanted to make sure, Dr. Moll, if you wanted to, do you want to kind of wrap it up, or do you want to take?
No, please go ahead.
Okay.
Doug, can I ask a brief question?
Certainly, go for it.
Dr. Moll, John Felix made a comment on the side that I thought was interesting. I'd love to get your take on it. He mentioned that at one point the proto-Orthodox, if you want to call them that, considered Paul the apostle of the heretics. They didn't want to include Paul or didn't acknowledge Paul as an authentic apostle, and that it took time for them to finally embrace him and consider them their own. And if that was the case, I'm curious if you acknowledge that was part of the development of the proto-Orthodox? And if that was the case, then isn't it possible that they didn't have possession of Paul until later, that it was the Marcionites that were the original possessors of Paul's valid original letters?
Well, that whole, Marcion made Paul popular idea has always been very strange to me, and for several reasons. First of all, we know that there is, from the early ages on, there is a movement that you will find in the pastoral epistles, Timothy and Titus, which were obviously not written by Paul, that people try to kind of connect to Paul and write in his name and try to establish Pauline theology. And you have the other side, which, for instance, in the Acts of Paul, in which you'll find the famous story of Thecla and Paul, Thecla being a very prominent female figure in early Christianity. So, and then Marcion. So many people in the first century and the early second century try to make Paul their own and try to say, we are the true Paulinists and we got him right. And if that's the case, it seems strange to me that Paul didn't become important before the mid of the second century, which doesn't mean that he was not, disputed and that some people didn't like him. We already find that in the letter of James, when James, the author, says that, look, it's not faith alone, you also need works, and so there is a debate going on about Paul, for some people being too pagan, as it were, and too little Jewish. It's a very simple way of putting it, but yeah, I hope you know what I mean. So he was a disputable character, no doubt, but he was definitely prominent and he was definitely important. And of course, once a heretical group like the Marcionites takes on Paul, he becomes even more questionable to others. But still, I don't see any time in the history of the church, not even in the first century, where Paul was not accepted by the Orthodox, the Catholic Church in general.
Seems like Daniel is going to be able to join us, so he should be in pretty quick. If you don't mind,
did he pass his test?
We'll find out.
Wait, do we have a pool going on?
Bandages.
Do we have a betting pool going on?
We could start one.
I've never seen him drive, so I don't know.
Yeah.
He's from Australia, so he probably took the car upside down.
Yeah.
and drove on the wrong side of the road.
That makes sense. Yeah.
I had a couple real quick general questions, if you don't mind,
sure,
on Marcion and Gnosticism.
Mm-hmm.
First one was, you did argue a very compelling case in your work in regards to Marcion's theology and how it related to Gnosticism, and in some ways didn't or wasn't connected to directly. And you argued that, unlike the Gnostics, Marcion seems not to have had anything like the mythology of the drama of the Pleroma, with the divine sparks and all that. As far as you're aware, do we know anything from any of our ancient sources dealing with Marcion or his theology, or even his later followers, in regards to like the origins of this evil creator god and then the good god? Like, what I'm thinking is, like, if you kind of put, I know it's not really scholarly per se, but like if you put yourself in Marcion's shoes, like, do you think he would have wrestled with this question of, where did this evil god come from? Why is he even existing? And where did this evil good god come from, where he had to kind of save people from the grasp of this evil creator god? Do we know anything about his kind of I don't want to say theology, but that
No, but I know what you mean.
Yeah, okay.
It's obviously very difficult to get into a second century person's mindset, be it Marcion or anybody else. So sometimes I wonder whether whether people in those days were so much, how can I put this, concerned with questions, where did this come from and why is that the way it is, and why should there be a God at all, and shouldn't, and so forth. So people that post-Enlightenment people, well, the questions that these people ask. And I think that Marcion may have been, in many ways, I don't mean this in a prerogative way, may have been a little more simple than we imagine. So he looks at the world and he reads the Old Testament and he sees, well, the world is, in his eyes, is bad, and well, it makes perfect sense reading the Old Testament and saying, well, this God obviously created a bad world. And so he, I don't know if he put himself in the position to, well, argue with God, as it were, to say, why are you there, evil God, and why is the other God there? So maybe that's just a question he did not ask and didn't come about at the time, because in many ways people tended to accept the world as it was a lot more, perhaps, in these days, and if they did not, they tried to establish, like the Gnostics, some sort of mythological explanation why these things happen, being the pleroma and the evil god falling and so forth. But let's face it, that's not a solution to the question why it is there. It's just a story of what might have happened, but I wonder if it's satisfactory to anybody.
Yeah, so basically, like, he may not even, unlike the Gnostics where they had this developed mythology of the pleroma and all that, Marcion may not have even dealt with that question.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure if, well, I hope I don't offend anybody here, but I think that the same is true for the Old Testament mythology. I mean, the fall of Adam and Eve and all these things, this is not historical data. This is it's an explanation, an attempt to explain why women have so much pain in giving birth, and why it is so hard to grow grain on a field, and why the world is the way it is. And so this is an attempt of explaining it, but I think they see things as they are and say, well, why is it like that? And then they come up with a explanation for it. And for Marcion, the explanation is simply that everything that the Old Testament says is true, and this God is well, to a certain extent, is a sadist, is a cruel God, a God who enjoys punishing people, a God who is jealous, in the literal meaning of the word, and that's the perfect explanation for him.
Thank you. One last question for me, and I'll be done. It's kind of related to Gnosticism again. I'm not sure if you've read her, but Elaine Pagels in one of her books kind of argued that Paul was. She thought, yeah, exactly, and that like Dale. I think she mentions this in her book too, but Dale put too, like Tertullian referred to Paul and against Marcion. Dale just put it in the side of that he was the quote-unquote apostle of the heretics. So you could say, well, the Gnostics and these other heretics kind of used Paul as their apostle. So what do you think of Elaine Pagels' idea, and how would it, if it were true, if you agree with it or not, how would it relate or change our view of Marcion's connection to Gnosticism, do you think, overall?
Well, the great thing about Gnosticism is that nobody knows what it actually is or was. So you can, well, put into it whatever you like and then say, well, Paul was a Gnostic. And that's what makes this whole thing so difficult. If you have, first you have to establish what you mean when you say Gnosticism. To me, the best definition is still by Christoph Marxies in a small book published in the 90s. There's 8 points, which are kind of more or less typical for a Gnostic worldview. And according to that, Paul certainly was not a Gnostic. That still doesn't mean that you could not interpret him in that way. I mean, Marcion interpreted Paul to say that Paul believed in two different gods, which is obviously nonsense. And so it is possible that people interpreted Paul in this particular way. And of course, Paul offers, particularly in the, well, most people would say it's not originally Paul, like Colossians or Ephesians, you find many, well, at least you find terminology that relates to Gnosticism, which is different from gospel terminology, for instance. And so you could make use of that and say, well, he is one of ours, you know, he's the first. And then, of course, the Gnostics always tend to believe that everything is secret knowledge, you know, and only them know what people mean when they say so. So it's easy to say that Paul used some sort of a code that only the Gnostics could understand.
I think it's proto-Gnosticism. It's not Gnosticism. It's some kind of a developing tradition. And I think Paul is probably as Gnostic as the Gospel writers are Gnostic. If you want to,
as John, for instance, yes, indeed.
Yeah, or like Marcion is Gnostic, or like even Philo of Alexandria can be considered a proto.
But that's the thing, when you mention Philo, I mean, the question is Gnosticism kind of a Christian denomination, or is it some sort of worldview that...
It's some kind of a weird syncretism going on in there.
Yes, indeed. So that's the point. So obviously, when you're syncretic, you can take things from Paul, as you can take things from others. And but coming back to the question about Paul's authority, once again, you can see that for some reason it was important for people to say Paul is one of us. You know, Paul is the first. Paul is the first Marcionite, or the first Gnostic, or the first Modliner. You know, and so that's where the authority comes. Paul must have been an important figure already in the first century. Otherwise, it makes no sense for James to argue against him, for Timothy and Titus. I call them that. They're not even written. They're addressed to Timothy and Titus, as you know. And all these people to somehow say we are in the Pauline tradition here. And that's why he must have been an important figure from the start.
Yeah, no one would bother claiming his authority if he didn't really have any. So yeah.
Yeah, but then that doesn't really explain all the seams in the letter of the Romans and in the letter of the Corinthians. And stuff like that. There's so many seams, you know. But yeah. In other words, there's no one Paul. There seems to be several different.
Indeed. I mean, actually, I was about to. Yeah. I'm about to publish a paper on that, on the question which Paul did Marcion know, and I think what is really underestimated is I don't know if all of you are aware of the Acts of Paul, which is a non-canonical text, and in which Paul is presented in a way which is very close to Marcion's idea of Paul, and no Paul. It's very, very close to that, and is very far away from the Paul that you'll find in Timothy and Titus, particularly as far as ethics are concerned.
Especially, and he's also painted, he's almost like he's the counterpart of the Jesus in the Jesus story.
Yes, indeed. And particularly as far as ethics are concerned, Paul in the Acts of Paul is a very anti-world Paul, saying we have to flee this world and have to do as little as possible with it. And he's a vegetarian. He is a teetotaler in the Acts of Paul. Just the way Marcion saw him, you know, as someone who spoke against alcohol, against meat consumption, and all these things. So it seems possible that there was a big fight about Pauline tradition already in the first century. And you'll find one, the prevailing one, which then became canonical in the end, which is presented in Timothy and Titus. And the other one, to which Marcion also adhered, went down. But there seem to be two different ideas of Paul and how he was, and you can, in fact,
at least.
At least. And the fun thing is the interesting thing is, you can argue both ways from his letters, because Paul is not always in what we call the original letters, is not always consistent, because in some places he seems to be rather liberal and saying, well, it doesn't really matter if you do this or that, and you can do whatever you want, and in other in others, he is much more strict and almost relentless when it comes to ethics. So you could argue both ways from the existing and presumably original letters from Paul.
Or we could armchair psychoanalyze him and just say he was schizophrenic. Maybe he just had schizophrenia.
Well, I think he was more of an epileptic, but well.
I've actually heard that theory before, and it's not, far-fetched. There's obviously no evidence, but.
Well, he was blind for some time,
Well, according to Axe, he was.
Yes, I'm joking, of course.
One of Reuven's questions was, he asked it earlier, Dr. Moll, the Muratorian canon mentions a letter to the Alexandrians that is rejected for not being a work of Paul. Was this a work of Marcion himself or a disciple of Marcion? Did Marcionites feel at liberty to write in the name of Paul, similar to other Greek authors such as Socrates and Galen?
Well, we have absolutely no evidence that Marcion or any of his followers is the author of that particular letter, which means it's possible, but again, there's really zero evidence for that. So I can't really deal with that question. As for your question whether they felt entitled to write in his name, I'd say no. I think that ship had sailed by the time Marcion appeared on the scene. I think that was something people did in the late 1st, maybe early 2nd century, but I think in the middle of the 2nd century it was too late to write letters and claim that they were actually Pauline. But again, the main answer remains that we have no evidence for Marcionites writing in Paul's name.
Just if I could piggyback on that, something I find interesting about the Marcionites compared to other heretical groups that feel at liberty. For example, like Valentinius seems to claim direct apostolic lineage to John in some way.
Yes.
Marcion, in my own research, Marcion's sort of a spiritual successor to Paul, but he's not like, oh, Paul personally anointed me himself. Yes. Or, yeah, they're much more, that end. They don't. The version of the gospel they have they don't need to sort of, similar to what Badoon has talked about. They don't need to sort of create this super narrative that ends with Marcion being crowned the king of the church. They don't seem to do that like other churches, other quote-unquote heretical churches do.
Yes. No, you're right. I mean, that's one of, in fact, you're absolutely right, and I think that is, well, I don't think, that is one of my main arguments why I think that Marcion has to be dated a little later than has been done. By the middle of the 2nd century, things change for Christians. We are now in the 3rd and 4th generation of Christians, and the feeling of producing scripture, as it were, is kind of over. From now on, they no longer produce scripture, but they interpret existing scripture. And that's a change that happens with Marcion and then with Irenaeus and others. And this is a big break for the church. But by break, I don't mean great thing to happen. It's just a break, a change, big change that is happening here. And Marcion may have been one of the first people to actually work that way, no longer producing scripture of his own, claiming that I have it from one of the apostles and I talked to Paul personally, but saying that I now have a canon. He established a canon, and this is now my holy text. This is my authoritative scripture. And again, this is a big step for the church.
I wanted to ask one more Reuven's questions that he wanted to get in. Dr. Moll, in your opinion, what was Marcion's take on the Gospel of John? Most scholars date the work prior to Marcion's rise, and the work was very popular including in Asia Minor, where the work is traditionally authored, and where Marcion was born and raised. There is much debate as to the theology and origins of the Gospel, but all agree that its theology is incompatible with Marcion's. Did Marcion know of the work and reject it? Was that a possible reason for the Roman Church rejecting him, for having too low a Christology? And was the work too Gnostic for Marcion to include in his canon?
Well, I mean, it's funny that you say it, because for some time people have been wondering why didn't he take John, because John is so much closer to his theology, because John doesn't have a birth story, you know, and Jesus is not born in the Gospel of John, which is, of course, an offensive idea to Marcion, because, well, Christ is not born of human flesh. Well, let me again say we have absolutely no evidence for any relation between Marcion and the Gospel of John. It is quite possible that he simply didn't know it. Again, possible, I say.
It's very possible that he didn't know it, considering that Irenaeus is the first one to mention it, and that's about 175.
Yes. So if I had to, you know, if you want to pinpoint me down on an answer, I'd say Marcion simply didn't know it.
Sure.
As for the question if he liked it or not, well, the thing is, Marcion also cut out things out of Luke. So none of the Gospels was 100% pleasing to him, assuming that he had the canonical version of Luke. And so it would have just as easy for him to change John according to his doctrine as he did with Luke. So I think the most reasonable answer is he simply didn't know it.
I'd like to add, Reuven, I'd like to also add that it's an interesting note. It's interesting to note that the gospel, the fourth gospel, is usually associated with the East as well. So it could be part of a part of the same traditional development of the same tradition, maybe, kind of.
Possible, yes.
Yeah. Did anyone else, Daniel, since you just kind of arrived, did you have any more questions for Dr. Moll, or anyone else? I'm kind of opening it up, or anyone want to revisit stuff we talked about, or did we miss any questions that were already submitted that anyone wanted answered?
I suppose mine's a bit idiosyncratic as a budding Marcionite scholar myself. And the question's been answered before, apparently, but that I asked because I was taking my driving test. But I'll pivot. You know, like I asked before, there does seem to be a return to Marcionite studies in the last decade, in the last 5 years in particular.
Yes.
What do you think the future holds, I suppose, would be the next question. Like, we have your monograph, we have Badoon's study of the canon, Lou is bringing out her sort of the Marcionite legacy. Yes. What do you think is next? What, in the next 10 years, what do you think PhD candidates might be turning their attention to that we've ignored?
Well, speaking of which, I am going to be in London next month as an external examiner for Viva. A student of Marcus Vincent's in London has written a thesis on Justin and Marcion.
Oh, nice.
So that's, yes. I know this is you know, insider information now. So of course we're publishing it all over the world, but it doesn't matter. No, so I'm not going to tell you anything about the content because it's still top secret. But this is obviously one book that is going to be out soon. The question of Marcion and well, Justin's relation to Marcion, which is of course in the whole thing a minor question, but it's important to analyze particular authors and their relationship to Marcion. And that is, of course, just from a pragmatic point of view for PhD students, it's always good to limit your topic by saying Justin and Marcion, or Marcion and this, and Marcion and that. And there was, my favorite example always is Gerhard May, who was in fact a professor in Mainz here until he died prematurely a couple of years ago. And he had this brilliant way of writing articles called Marcion and the Interpretation of Genesis. And his conclusion would be that Marcion didn't interpret Genesis. Well, that's good, you know. I mean, you can always write articles with the result that the whole question didn't make sense. Yeah, but it's tricky to come up with new things. We might as well be at a time when we had a huge Marcion hype, and now things kind of cooling down. Of course, for the New Testament section, they will go on. I mean, we have now Marcus Vincent's rather questionable theories about the gospel and other things, so they will keep arguing simply because of the manpower that the New Testament has. As for patristics, I think we have kind of established what there is to establish. And of course, you would argue the same thing with New Testament scholars, but New Testament scholars never run out of theories and new ways of interpreting things. So it's really difficult for me to say. I never expected this. When I published my book in 2009, it was one of the first new books on Marcion. And ever since, we had 5, 6, 7 new publications, which was unthinkable at the time. And which is nice for me. It's nice to see that people care about stuff that I care about. But I really wonder if maybe it has come to an end now, and we will maybe another 100 years for people to come up with new ideas about Marcion.
Archaeology is your only hope.
Yes.
Yeah, we need new documents.
Well, that would be changed. That would be. But no, but we do have. I mean, we now have for the first time we have reliable reconstructions of the gospel. 2, in fact. And that's a big step, and that will enable people to work more closely with. I would have loved to have such a reconstruction at the time I worked. But so this is a big step, definitely a big step.
That was my takeaway from particularly Badoon's book, where Badoon was simply sort of laying down the foundation. Yes. He wasn't really creating a huge mega structure, but rather, okay, guys, I built you a playground. Now go explore.
Yes, indeed. And this will, this will have a huge impact on New Testament scholarship, I'm pretty sure. And maybe people will, I mean, I always felt that this whole argument was Luke first or was Marcion first. It is really so much speculation in that I think you will never find a conclusive answer to that question. Of course, now then with Marcus Vincent arguing that Marcion had the first gospel ever, you know, and everything else is later, and that's a whole new idea brought.
Oh yeah, I don't think that's not the same argument though, but I think I rather like Badoon's idea. I think he's at least piqued my interest, and I think he's probably correct in thinking that rather than Marcion being an editor, rather that the two different, the proto-orthodoxy and the Marcionites they started off from the same tradition and then they took it from there. Jason Badoon's line of thinking I'm describing.
Yes. No, and as I said at the beginning, it's perfectly possible. I'm not an expert in the New Testament field. As I said at the time I was writing, I worked with what I had, and I believe that I was doing the best I could, and I still think that, well, I have not, again, only last month there was another reconstruction on Marcion. Coming up by detailed draft. And so I have not been yet at the time to actually compare the two or see where.
No, it's cool, and I think this is how scholarship works. It's like you did actually a really good job in elucidating all the traditional patristic sources into a traditional what is really the traditional argument.
Yeah.
But I'm glad that there are other people who are contributing to the discussion in terms of talking about the polemics, talking about the editing aspects, evangelizing aspects,
Yes.
like we were talking about before. I think there's a lot more to be learned in this, but I think that yours was a necessary step along the way.
Oh, well, thank you. And as I said, it's scholarship doesn't stop with me, and it will always go on.
Yeah, totally.
And yeah, indeed. So, and I look forward to Judith Liu's book. Although I was kind of displeased that she wrote in this advertising text with Cambridge University Press. It says, "This is the first comprehensive study on Marcion for almost a century." But actually, I wrote to Cambridge University Press and told them, look, I understand that you want to make this book sound as exciting as possible, and I'm sure that Liu adds a lot of information to the debate that I did not add. But still, first comprehensive study in a century.
Yeah, but I mean, I would include you, I would include Tyson, I would include Knox in 1942. I mean, and so it's been there's been a little bit, not a lot, but there's been a little bit.
No, definitely. I mean, it certainly Liu's book. I mean, I haven't read it yet, but it's certainly just from the mere size of it, it's the largest book on Marcion.
And actually, I don't know if you've listened to her, but she seems to be on the ball. I'm really looking forward to that one.
Well, she is definitely one of the greatest experts in the field. And the funny thing was, as I mentioned earlier, when I started working on my PhD thesis, she was already working on her book as well. And that made me quite nervous at the time, just as Professor Kinzig in Bonn, Germany, was also working on his. So, as I said, it was this big race going who would publish first.
Yeah, I appreciated that point that you made earlier. I think you're absolutely right about that. It's like once the gates, I think once the Jesus seminar, the Acts seminar, once these gates, the popular books start coming out, all of a sudden it's just a race. It's kind of like, Jimi Hendrix was the first one to do that weird distorted guitar thing, but it was on the way.
Yes, indeed. It's somehow in the air, but someone has to make the first step. No, but of course, you see, Liu's book would have killed mine. Mine obviously doesn't kill hers. So I'm glad it broke out this way. Yeah. And of course, mine's a slow PhD thesis, which doesn't compare to hers, 600-page book, which she wrote in about over 10 years. So I look forward to it. And she is definitely one of the greatest scholars in the field. And so, yeah.
Like I said, I think yours was a very necessary step, and I think yours essentially is a really good encapsulation of what I would deem the traditional account of
That's
Marcion.
true. At least as far as New Testament is concerned. As far as the others are concerned, it's less conservative, but yes, at New Testament, that's true.
Right.
Dr. Moll, I was wondering, because the distinction you make I find really interesting. As somebody myself who's trying to get into this field professionally, don't try and talk me out of it. I've heard it all, but I find it very interesting, the distinction between like New Testament scholarship and patristic scholarship, because I originally, when I started my undergraduate studies and my graduate studies, I believed I was going to be a New Testament scholarship. I wanted to be a New Testament scholar, but now I find myself more and more drawn to patristics for many reasons. One of them, it's a less crowded field. Like,
no doubt.
But how do you define, I suppose, the divide? Because something I find concerning in the field, particularly with evangelical scholars who I have dialogue with academically, it seems like study sort of stops after the Book of Revelation. And something I've learned from my own study is like you've got to bring it all the way at least to 200 at least, to kind of really understand the growth of Christianity. Do you think that's a fair assessment? How do you think patristics and New Testament scholarship can sort of work together better in the future?
This has definitely changed. I mean, 100 years ago, New Testament scholars really and exclusively dealt which was called the New Testament, the 27 texts which are contained in the New Testament. And over the last century, they expanded and went way into the 2nd and even 3rd century, worrying more about things like canonization of the New Testament and how certain fathers like Irenaeus or other early fathers worked with the New Testament. This is, for one, simply necessary because you can't, for 2,000 years always work with the same text and still expect to find new answers. So it was really a measure of common sense to kind of expand a little bit. And the other thing is, of course, there is no, you can't separate the New Testament era from the patristic era. That is something that, of course, particularly in the Protestant tradition, which is very common, particularly in the Lutheran tradition here in Germany. You see, because the idea was always that the New Testament is kind of a world of its own. And so once the New Testament stops, then this time is over and the church begins. And we are kind of dealing with two different eras. But of course, from an historical point of view, that's nonsense. We know that the New Testament, both writing of the text and canonization of the text, goes hand in hand with the development of patristic theology. So,
the history of patristics is the history of ecclesiology, or whatever the word is.
Indeed, indeed.
Yeah.
So this is why, in fact, as for me, I'm one of the kind of last patristics to work with Marcion. He has by now become a topic for actually New Testament scholars only, almost, which was very different 100 years ago. And yes, well, you have my blessing going to patristics. As far as your career is concerned, I think it is obviously a wider field, and you can probably establish a little more than you could with the New Testament. As far as I'm concerned, I've been to several New Testament conferences, and usually I go, of course, to patristics, but there aren't so many, so I also go to New Testament conferences. And somehow, for me, they worry a lot about details and certain words. And sometimes I wonder, is it perhaps possible that Paul meant the same with the word so-and-so in Romans as he did in Corinthians? But that would make a lot of New Testament scholars jobless. Yes, I would definitely, if you'd ask me for my personal advice, I would advise you to go into patristics because it's a more interesting field. But that is a very personal opinion, of course.
No, I totally get it. And that was sort of, I'm sorry guys for taking this over, this will be my last thing. But
no, don't worry about it.
Working on my thesis on 1 Corinthians 7, I was just like, oh my goodness, like, I have to read like 50 books to just debate over the interpretation of this one Greek word.
Yeah.
But with Marcion, with Marcion and Justin, there's, the way I was raised academically in the field is scholarship is about joining a conversation. Scholarship is about joining a table, adding an argument, adding ideas, exchanging thoughts, exchanging notes, exchanging criticism. And my professor said the problem with the New Testament table is it's too damn big and no one wants to listen to each other.
Right.
and what I found with Marcion, all I had to do was I could dialogue with Joseph Hossman, Joseph Tyson, yourself. Soon, it's like a table of 7 people, and we can exchange ideas a bit freely. So yeah. Anyway, so I'll stop rambling.
The table is getting bigger as we speak. There are more people. But no, you're right. I mean, let's face it. You have about the same amount of people in the world worrying about these, as I say, 27 texts in the New Testament, as you have people worrying about 2,000 years of church history. And so there is a certain, weird relation. I admit, of course, the New Testament is very important for theology, no doubt. But I agree with you that you have maybe a few too many people working in the field. You definitely don't have that in patristics. So.
Hey, Moll, I had some more questions I wanted to add in now. One is, did you actually watch our videos for our Hangouts discussing your paper, or just the first one?
I didn't watch them all, no, sorry.
You just watched the first one, okay. My other question regarding that was whether you had any comments on whether we presented your thesis properly or if we misunderstood anything, but if you didn't watch them all, that's pretty...
Well, from what I've seen, I can say that you got it right, but as I said, I didn't see it all.
Yeah. My other question was, if you get the idea of what we do in these Hangouts, do you have any book that we might not have considered yet that we should probably do a Hangout on in the future? We do lots of different books, Old Testament, New Testament. I don't think we've discussed doing anything on the patristics.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, any good kind of overview of patristics and different views of the church fathers? Anything out there like that you would recommend?
We try to do books that we can get to everybody without costing money. So
sure.
Things that are out of copyright.
Out of copyright,
we have permission to distribute.
I mean, of course, there are. Of course, there are a lot of classic authors in around 1900. Very interesting. Very interesting books, particularly. Well, if you want to stay in the perhaps same field with Marcion, there's one of my favorite. Well, when I was still teaching in Britain, I was of course looking for smaller books, comprehensive books that I could recommend to my students. And but of course there are several good books on the Gnostics that you might want to consider. The one by Chris Marcion has in fact been translated, but it's not out of copyright yet. There's one by what's his name? Greenslade? I'm not entirely sure. I have to look it up. And wrote a book on schism in the early church, which is still my favorite book on schism in the early church. And very interesting. And he was a bishop or reverend of the Anglican Church, which is in fact in this case a good thing, because most of these people, well, if you have clergymen working in these subjects, they usually write books which are very easily accessible and very readable. So that would be a recommendation. It's a very short book. Of course, this is more of a comprehensive sum up of the situation, not exactly a brand new theory he brings forth. But let me think. Let me just think about it a little bit more while we go on in the discussion. Maybe I come up with something.
I had another question I wanted to throw in. I don't want to monopolize this, but I really want to get this question in. Your thesis talks a lot about Marcion, what we know about Marcion's views on a lot of different subjects. I don't remember the subject of eschatology or apocalypticism coming up.
Mm-hmm.
Did Marcion believe in the imminent end of the world, or is it already an old idea by the 2nd century, so it was going out of vogue, or what would you think about that?
Well, he actually, again, if we can trust Tertullian, Marcion believed that somehow by the end of time, those who did not believe in Christ were, consumed by the fire of hell by the Old Testament man God, while the others, those who believe in Christ, are of course saved. That's what Tertullian says in his argument against Marcion. So we don't know, and that's a funny thing, there doesn't seem to be the idea of a second coming of Christ, which was then of course very important for the church, and ever since then became part of the creed and everything. That seems to be absent from Marcion's thought, but he does believe that there is an afterlife, and there is a time in which, like Judgment Day, there will be a day on which everybody will be judged, and only those are saved who believe in Christ, and all the others will, in fact, burn. That's what he says, and that's what Tertullian says about him.
Thank you.
Did you want me to read that, Reuven?
There's no parousia There's no parousia.
Well, again, from what we know.
Well,
yeah. There seems to be this seems to be strangely absent from.
But there's no parousia, and what we're being saved from is the God of the world. So it's a very strange picture.
Yes, well, I mean, for Marcion, of course, living in this world is like living in hell, you know, because he hates the world so much that it.
Oh, he has no idea. I've lived in I don't know where he lived, but I've lived in some pretty messed up places.
What I would like to develop in my own studies, because this is interesting, I hadn't thought about this before. Something that I found striking in doing my own work on Marcion was Marcion the Evangelist, that he seems to have an imperative to change people's minds, to save them, to save the corrupted church, to save the corrupted gospel. But if the parousia is lacking from his thought, as far as we know, like we don't really know either way.
Then where's the fire? What's the rush?
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, what does Marcion, like, if Marcion has this imperative to save people who are already, like, maybe his imperative is not so much related to eschatology, but rather, it's almost like a Protestant, like, I hate turning it into modern categories, but, you know, where you have, like, these, particularly Pentecostals who are like, you're living in sin and you've got to be saved right now, like, come to Jesus today. It's almost sort of like that, like, this world is agony until you find Marcion's Jesus.
Yes, sorry. Well, I think most Pentecostals today would have been much too happy for Marcion to go along with. But other than that, no, you're right, he was, and this is perhaps the only way in which he actually compares to Luther or other Reformation characters, that he was that serious about his mission. He believed to have some sort of calling, and it was his mission to tell people the news, the good news or the bad news or both, but to spread the word. Definitely, he had this sense of of being called and having this mission to the world. And he was anxious about that, no doubt. I mean, who wouldn't? You know, I mean, if you had this idea, you would make sure that you do the best you can and then try to get as many people as you could on your side or on God's side.
Dr. Moll, we had a write-in question from Stephen Holler. Did you see it on the side there?
I may have overlooked it. No, sorry.
Okay, it's in the chat. If you wanted, I could read it.
Please.
Or basically, he's saying he's saying that, you know, it seems like our sources are disagreeing. He says, to quote him, he says, okay, I'll just read it. He says, why can't German scholars admit that we don't know nearly enough about Marcionism to make broad, sweeping conclusions about the tradition? With our sources disagreeing on virtually everything about the tradition, aren't Germans, a people who naturally gravitate toward order and rigid thinking, the last people who should define what Marcionism is? And that's his phrasing. I'm sorry about that.
I mean, for the moment, I'm actually about the only German who's working on Marcion. All the others are British or American. So, well, I don't really know where this argument is coming from. It is, of course, it is true. We have little evidence to make any, sure conclusions, but that goes for just about everything in early church history. And I'm the last one to neglect this, and I always admit that many things are insecure, and that we are insecure about several things, and that we can only work with what we have. This is, in fact, the reason that many people ask me, why is your book so short, so thin, you know, and don't you think you could write a little bit more about that? And I always said, look, if you give me more evidence, I'll be pleased to write more. But I work with the evidence I have, and I just don't have more. And this is what I can make of it. And of course I work with speculations as everybody else. And I try to, one of my teachers in Edinburgh always said, don't let evidence get in the way of your theories. And that's, of course, a joke, but it's not my way of working. And I always try not to make that mistake. And so this is, well, again, there will always be new material, and there will always be, especially as far as New Testament scholarship is concerned, there will be more to that. But especially Marcion's biography, that's why I pinpointed it down to a few things that we know, that a few things that we can establish, that where he was born, what he did for a living, and some other things, and that's about it. We don't know how tall he was, we don't know whether he was wearing a beard or whatever, that's just something we don't know. And yeah, I perfectly agree with that. I think
Germanisms aside, I think that his point is valid, at least in the sense of it's okay to just say we don't know, Because my problem with the dating of Marcion's life is if he only started in 144, and already by Justin Martyr in 150 or so, he's already has a worldwide movement. Something doesn't make sense about that to me.
No, you're perfectly right. And I mean, what I argue in my paper is, my thesis is, that maybe this, when Justin says it has spread about the whole world, actually he says it is known with all people. This may as well be an exaggeration, but you're right. It is, again, we have several evidence that says it started in 1144. Justin is a counter-argument, and you just have to decide which is stronger. I mean, that's the way it works. And I mean, again, I'm always I try to be as honest as possible as I can about these issues. That I say, look, this is what we have and what I can work with.
Yeah, such flexibility and such latitude is always appreciated in scholars. I think so. No, seriously,
that was the thing.
A lot of scholars are not so. They'll stand. They won't let evidence get in the way of their theory.
That was the thing. Leon and I, in the studies that I attended, we had some back and forth, but I think we both agree, Leon, that one of the things we really appreciated about your work, Dr. Moll, was the fact that you do caveat so much of your writing where it's like, it seems to me, or we could probably, or most likely, or we just don't know.
It's not beyond the realm of possibility. You consider that, yeah.
As a budding scholar myself, I really appreciated that language, because some people, as Leon pointed out, it's like, and we know for certain this happened, and it's like, no, that's like one of the most hottest debated topics in scholarship right now. You can't just
I just read a question about the translation from German.
Yeah.
Yeah, Wayne was wondering about that specific one that was in your work.
I think that's a quote from Lampe.
Yeah.
Peter Lampe from Heidelberg. Well, that means, you see, people have argued that, well, actually it's in Tertullian, that Marcion was kind of influenced by Epicurus. And so what in fact is what they have in common, that both Epicurus and Marcion argue about the status of the world and wonder how a good God, a perfect God, could have created such an imperfect world. And this is, for some people, this has been kind of evidence that Marcion was influenced by Epicurus. And Lampe argued, and it's kind of a joke that he makes about that. He says that doesn't already a 14-year-old boy come up with this argument, without knowing Epicurus personally, and I think that's true. I mean, the idea about the world being bad and trying to find an explanation for it, you really don't need Epicurus for that. And in fact, Lampe uses a very old-fashioned term there, Untersekundana, which is a very old-fashioned German term for someone who is, let me calculate, who is in the 10th grade of high school. But this term hasn't been used in German for like 50 years, so Lampe isn't that old, so actually don't know why he uses that term. But you will have a hard time looking it up because nobody uses it.
Most of the German in your paper I was able to roughly figure out using Google Translate. And even in this case, I knew the general idea that you were trying to get. But I couldn't make sense of the sentence said as a sentence.
What it means, what it means, a direct translation would be something like, it's not rocket surgery.
Something like that, yeah.
Indeed, yes. You don't need to be a genius, you don't have to. I mean, that's another thing that I always argue, that for some reason, scholars, maybe it's the way they work, scholars have a hard time imagining that two people at different times in different places come up with the same idea,
Right.
And there always has to be a connection, And
it's called it's like parallelomania.
And it's the same with Marcion, and there was always this argument that he was influenced by a certain Jewish scholar, saying that this person, established a very little reading of the Old Testament, and this must have influenced Marcion. And I say, look, isn't it possible that a person comes up with the idea to read a text literally on his own? I think that's perfectly possible. So,
I'm pretty convinced that time travel actually exists. Because a lot of people keep stealing my ideas and then taking them back in time so they have them before me.
Anyway, guys, I've got to get going, but I just want to say I'm looking forward to listening to the first hour. Thank you so much for being able to give up your time, Dr. Moll. I really appreciate it, and thanks for emailing with me backwards and forwards trying to get this thing in the works. And on a personal level, I really appreciated your book. It helped me a lot with my own master's thesis back home in Australia on Marcion and Gnosticism. So thank you very much, and I'll see you at SPL sometime, I hope.
Well, thank you.
Thanks, Daniel, for arranging this.
Yeah, and I'll follow your career with great interest.
Thank you. Bye, guys.
Bye, Daniel. So did anyone have any last pressing questions? I wanted to be, when we finish, I wanted to ask one kind of finishing question, but I want to make sure that no one had any pressing questions, because I know Dr. Moll has to teach tomorrow morning, he said, so.
Yeah, we should probably
wrap it up. Almost midnight here, but it's fine.
Okay. So no other super pressing questions? We can wrap it up?
I'm impressed how well he dressed up for this hangout.
Yeah, well,
he's going disco dancing after this.
I don't know. Yeah, I had this. That's a cliche I have with me for the last 10 years. That also always in Edinburgh, I seem to be voted, best dressed male. Always, but I don't know. It's me. I don't do this for a particular reason. It just makes me feel good, and I always like to, dress up a little bit for these occasions.
You look sharp. I mean, you blew my chances of being the best looking guy here.
I didn't say, well, you're still the best looking guy. I'm just the best dressed.
All right. Well, the closing question is, where are you headed personally as far as your work in the field, New Testament studies, patristic studies, and early Christianity? Where are your interests taking you, and is there anything that you're working on currently or upcoming that's we should keep an eye open for, or anyone listening? And do you have a website or a blog or anything people can go to find out more about your work and stuff like that? Anything you want to promote, basically?
Well, I have actually a column in a paper, but this is for. I'm also a freelance journalist in Germany, but I write on political issues or political religious issues here. But this might not be as interesting to you guys. And other than that, in fact, in the fall, a new book of mine is coming out, but again, not on Marcion or anything else series. It's about The Simpsons. I'm writing a book on The Simpsons and theology, the Gospel according to Homer.
Jeebus.
And that's just a little thing I'm working on at the moment. And other than that, I'm waiting for, as I said at the beginning, for this habilitation to kick in, so to speak. Then I can apply for chair. I also have two other applications running at the moment, but again, this is not so interesting for this group, I think. So I'm afraid no large book on anything in patristics, the New Testament, coming out soon, but I'll keep you posted.
Okay, great. Yeah, keep us posted. If anything comes up, we'll let our small group know for sure. So we want to keep.
And let me just ask one thing about you guys. I mean, do you work in this professionally, or is it just a group of Bible people who are interested in that?
We're just lay people, with the exception of Daniel, who just left. He's actually entering postgraduate or graduate studies, where he's actually going to write a thesis.
How did you guys find each other? Is that how did it?
We would need another hour for that, probably.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Well, the simple answer is that most of us listen to a podcast hosted by Dr. Robert M. Price, and we pretty much found each other through the listeners group on Facebook there. And then we started this thing to actually read books about the Old Testament and the New Testament. We go back and forth, and just to discuss these books with each other, because we all do this reading on our own. We thought it'd be fun to discuss it with each other. And like Leon said, most of us are just really enthusiastic amateurs. We love the Bible and early church history and Old Testament history and all that stuff. Like he said, Daniel's in the field professionally, and Dale, I think, has a degree in the field too. But yeah, we're basically just enthusiastic about it. So
that's good.
Yeah. So anyway, thank you so much from all of us for taking the time to out of your day and staying up late for us to talk to us about your work. It's really great to actually be able to talk to the author of something we're reading. So we really appreciate it.
And I'm always glad when people when you are. I mean, I sold 5 copies and you bought all 5 of them, so it's I'm glad as well, of course. I mean, a scholar is always pleased when people read his books and theories and discuss them. So it's no chore at all. I really enjoy talking to you guys about this, particularly because I haven't been over the last years. I haven't been talking about Marcion so much because I've been busy with other things like Schweitzer or other topics. So it's nice to actually back into this and see what is new. And actually, I learned a lot from you too, because I'm some of these articles you mentioned I wasn't even aware. So it's a win-win situation.
Well, after this is on YouTube for a little while, you might need a second printing of your book. Just warning you, because they're going to be flying up the
another 5 copies.
Did you know that there is a Spanish translation of the book?
Oh, I didn't know that. No, that's interesting.
Yeah, wait a second. I have it here somewhere too.
There's a Spanish translation?
Yes.
Oh, that's cool. How can I get that gig?
Can you move it over a little bit? There we go. Okay, I can see it now. Oh, that's interesting.
Nice.
And this is only like $20 or something. So nice. If any of you read Spanish.
Perfect. Cool.
I do, and I think English was it's probably my preferred one at this point. But I'd like to. I'm interested in knowing how one gets that gig, because I read so many New Testament and early Christian history that would be a good gig for me, translating all these works into Spanish.
Actually, man, it's funny. Even just this little thing at the end on Amazon, where they sell my book and also Spanish version, of course. They gave me a new nickname. Apparently, it sounds better if the author, has a Spanish name. So on Amazon, I am now Sebastian Moll de Miguel.
Moll de Miguel?
De Miguel, yes. Which is fine. I mean, I don't mind if it helps selling the product. But I found it interesting that they made this up. They're just making up names.
All right, well, thank you again, and everyone watching in the future, make sure you go out and buy Dr. Moll's book, At the Left Hand of Christ, the Arch-Heretic Marcion. Great book, all about Marcion. So, anyway, thank you very much. It was a lot of fun. And,
Well, you have a good remainder of the day, and I'm about to go to bed.
All right, well, thank you. And next week we'll be starting, that's March 1st, Sunday, we'll be starting, this is for everybody watching, we'll be starting Margaret Barker's book, The Great Angel. So tune in next week, and thank you. See you guys around.